This is Melinda James on ABC Illawarra.
Well, look, while we're talking about hip pocket, of course, petrol is one of those things that does have a big influence on inflation and the prices you pay at the supermarket as well for just your ordinary day-to-day goods. And, of course, we saw the Consumer Price Index here in Australia rising 1.3% in the last quarter of last year. So that means inflation for the full 2021 year is 3.5%. Now, that's well above where the RBA likes it to sit, in that range of 2 to 3%. What's this going to mean for interest rates? We're going to see them rise as well sooner than anticipated. Martin North, local financial analyst, of course, is here to help us make a little bit of sense of this too. Martin, good morning.
Hello there.
Okay, so inflation up, and up a fair degree too. Most of this, though, pandemic related, would you think?
Well, it was certainly higher than a lot of analysts were expecting. And then the really big question is it temporary or is it more permanent? And whilst there were some adjustments, so for example, compared with the previous quarter in some states, electricity subsidies were removed, which put the price of electricity up a lot. There were also some worrying signs of more embedded inflation. In other words, the costs are really going up. And interestingly, of course, the average masks reality for many people. One way of looking at it is the comparison between what's called discretionary and non-discretionary items. In other words, the things you have to buy versus the things you choose to buy. And interestingly, the non-discretionary inflation was up at 4.5%. So that's like food and fuel and childcare and petrol, all of those things. Whereas discretionary items like your new TV or whatever was only 1.9%. So what we're seeing is in certain categories now, inflation is definitely a lot higher than a lot of people expected. And I am looking at the data and thinking, this is more than just a reaction to the pandemic and supply chain issues. This is a much more structural issue that we're seeing. And,
what makes you think that, though, Martin? Because I would have thought, for example, we just heard there some of the influences on the increase in petrol prices. We know that some of the, I don't know if some of the increases in food prices are to do with transport, logistics, freight, workforce issues that are pandemic related. What makes you think that some of the influences here are not so much related to the pandemic and might be more structural, as you said, and so therefore last longer?
Well, there's a couple of observations. So let's look at rentals first. Now, rentals are very important because it is the best proxy that is used to try and measure the cost of housing. And interestingly, in Sydney and Melbourne, the CPI number went backwards. In Sydney, it was down for rental of units, down 5%, whereas in Melbourne, a bit less. In other areas, it was high. The costs of property, look at mortgage costs, look at the average mortgage, is definitely understated in those numbers. And we know now that rentals are beginning to move up. So we know that in many places rents are rising. Now that's more structural than just pandemic related. So I think the cost of housing is definitely another interesting one. If you look at by category, clothing and footwear was very strong. And that's because some of those categories, well, frankly, retailers can charge more. It's basically a little bit less elastic to price compared with others. So what it means is that people can actually, will still buy them and will pay more. And another interesting one, if you look at things like childcare costs, they're definitely rising. And if you also look at just the day-to-day issues to do with transport, we discussed petrol earlier on and fuel, a lot of those costs are actually embedded in so many other things, so they flow through. So unless you're going to see a dramatic turnaround in the international price of oil, which I suspect we're not going to see, you can certainly say that transportation sectors are going to continue to burn hard. And another interesting one, insurance and financial services was also up. They've put their fees up. So, these are not just things that are supply chain related.
Yeah,
and so, it is, and one quick other point. If you look at it down at a household level, not all households are equally impacted. If you look at those households who have a more limited budget and, maybe just renting, my calculation is that their true inflation metric is about 3 times the average Whereas those in more affluent areas, because they spend less on non-discretionary items, their real inflation is a lot lower. So even across individual households, this average number doesn't tell you that much.
Okay. Just finally then, Martin, we know that, particularly with the price of petrol remaining as it is, a lot of people would say one big inflationary result is not enough to force the Reserve Bank to act earlier on interest rates. Or is it? Are we likely to see interest rates go up sooner than we thought, and even as soon as what? When do they meet? Next Tuesday, don't they?
Well, that's the next meeting. It'll be I'd love to be a fly on the wall in that meeting because they have been way off on their inflation targeting and forecasting for a long, long time. They said 2024 before rates will go up, and they were saying, well, the inflation that we've currently got, we wouldn't see till next year. So they've been off target considerably. Also, internationally, of course, we know that the Fed announced today, they're going to start lifting rates next month. So the international context is higher rates. Locally, the banks are already lifting fixed mortgage rates. The Reserve Bank is going to have to move sooner. It's a question of how soon. Some people are saying August. I think that's probably reasonable. But, the medium-term outlook here is definitely higher interest, unless the COVID thing really comes back and the economy collapses, or we get a huge international crisis like, for example, up in Europe or in Asia, with China. Those big questions are always there. But assuming not, then I think we're going to see interest rates rising, and that's going to hit a lot of mortgage holders. 75% are on variable rates. Those rates will go up. And by the way, the banks are now encouraging people to take variable rates rather than fixed rates. Why? Because it insulates them from future rate rises.
Exactly. Oh, yeah. Interesting times ahead, particularly over the next few months. Thanks so much for your insights this morning, Martin.
Good to talk to you.
That is Martin North, our financial analyst. How do you feel hearing all that? A little bit nervous about the future?